it's really an honor to be a part of the discussions the conversation that you're having here. It's such an important conversation. So thanks for inviting me. So as Kirby said, I'm a senior scientist at the University of Montana Flathead Lake Biological Station. I'm actually zooming in to all of you from the Tunaka Nation lands. I'm down in Fernie, British Columbia right now, and we're actually out doing water quality data collection in the Elk Valley, where much of my experience comes from on mining taking place here. And this is actually a picture of one of the mines in the Elk Valley. This is open pit mountaintop removal coal mining in the Elk Valley that has been ongoing for nearly 100 years and about 70 years above ground with the mining here. So as Kirby said, much of my work is in partnership with the Transboundary Tunaka Nation, which is actually 6 governments, 2 governments south of the US-Canada colonial border and 4 governments north of the border in the Transboundary Kootenay watershed. And then I also work on the ground up in the Taku watershed with the Taku River Tlingit First Nation, also on legacy mining impacts up there from the Tulsa Chief mine, and then also doing data collection on the ground for potential mining in that watershed and also related to climate change impacts to fish and water, salmon, and water overall in that watershed. And this is sort of the geographic region that I focus on in my work, and both looking at large transboundary rivers, and also, unfortunately, one of the things all of these watersheds have in common is that there are either legacy mining impacts, actually all of them have legacy mining impacts, ongoing mining, or proposed mining. So sort of the interface of these big, very important watersheds, rivers that we have in northwestern North America, and then the prospects of mining resources underground. And so just a little bit about myself. I love rivers. I come from studying river ecology as an undergrad and a grad student. And I just think rivers are, an amazing gift to us on this planet. And over time, as a master's student, I ended up starting to look at the impacts of coal bed methane development, so gas development, and then ultimately coal mining development from some of our big rivers, and also just starting to learn more about metal mining and critical minerals and sort of that conversation that's also being had in these landscapes. And so to understand how mines affect rivers, and I know some of this may be repetitive, so I'll try not to go too deep into anything. But to understand how mines impact rivers, it really takes a deep understanding of how mines work and how rivers work. And so I really like this cartoon just because it sort of shows, when you have a mountain, that's the sort of shadow in the background. You remove, in the case of open pit coal mining or any time of open pit mining, you remove the land over the seam you're trying to access. Because these are often in watersheds or rivers, the waste and overburden is placed into the river. And then at that point, everything that is underground in the geology of the land or a product of the mining process itself becomes in contact with air and water. And once you're mining waste or your geology or your infrastructure are in contact with air and water, they become mobilized, because that's how rivers work. And once they're in there, it's really difficult to get them out. And so this is just to sort of show how once anything associated with your mining infrastructure comes in contact with land or water, you have the potential to transport that across the watershed and the land. And this is just a second picture of that. Here in the Elk Valley, where I am right now, selenium is one of the most prominent aspects of the geology. So there's a lot of selenium in the rock underground. And as a consequence of the mining, selenium has been unearthed and then mobilized in groundwater and surface water sort of throughout the watershed. And because these mines have been in place for nearly a century, the reach of that selenium and mine contaminants is pretty far. There's a lot of selenium that's been released into the watershed over time, and it's gone a lot further distance than was ever anticipated originally. And so just to sort of big picture overview, it sounds like you guys talked a lot about data collection, baseline data collection, and I completely agree. It is such an important aspect of understanding how mines will impact people and communities and rivers. And so I think of things in terms of like the ultimate, if you put a contaminant from a mine into a watershed, it's very best to anticipate how far that's going to go throughout the landscape. And in the case of these mines, these are pictures of the Elk Valley mines. Our main contaminants are selenium, nitrates, and sulfates. Nitrates are a product of the blasting, so they are introduced completely by the mining process, but there's so much blasting that they've become at very high levels in the watershed. And sulfates and selenium and other metals are all part of the geology. So whatever's in your geology below the mine potential will become a contaminant that will need to be addressed. And then it's really important to mine environmental assessments, I would say, in my experience, always underestimate how far contaminants can go in the environment. And they always seem to underestimate the breadth. So how much life can be impacted across the landscape, whether it's algae in the rivers or aquatic insects, birds, wildlife. Human health impacts are really poorly understood, and they tend to receive the least amount of attention. They seem to be an afterthought in the environmental assessment processes when they should really be front and center, in my opinion. And so these are just some of the lessons learned over time in the watersheds that I've been working in. And this is just, you know, any aspect of life that comes in contact with a river over the course of its life history is a potential receptor for mine contamination. I really love the picture of the wolves and the elk in the bottom there, because people often overlook wildlife, and river corridors are so important to all of the ungulates and carnivores and all the creatures, you know, in riparian corridors. So we often just focus in on fish or water quality, but it's really important to remember that every wildlife and every human that relies on the river for their livelihood is a potentially impacted by mining contamination. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit more on the big picture side of things, of some lessons learned and then some solutions. So hard lessons, but then amazing solutions that are coming out of some of these watersheds and the First Nations that I've been working with over time that are dealing with mining in their landscapes, and mining of all different phases, whether it's exploration or ongoing or legacy impacts. And so climate change is never gets enough attention in environmental impact assessment or throughout the mining assessment process. Climate change is drastically changing these landscapes at a scale we've never seen before, and it's very hard to anticipate how it will affect mines and rivers and people. And so we really have to make room for climate change. And so that's some of the things I have here are, you know, reduce environmental stressors that are not climate change oriented, build space into land use plans that allow species and people to shift. So rather than just putting our protected areas in one tiny little space and expecting that that's going to stay the same over time, we need to anticipate that water that's cold enough for salmon right now might not be cold enough for salmon into the future. So creating more space in our land use planning to allow for salmon and other wildlife and fish to adapt to changing temperatures. And then I can't emphasize enough, like groundwater, surface water interactions. So this picture here is in the Taku watershed. That's a landslide that occurred around Christmas of 2020. And that entire face of that mountain sloughed off and ran across, ended up deposited in the river several kilometers wide. And if there had been a mine sitting there, you can only imagine, the catastrophe that would have resulted from, a landslide of that scale into that watershed, and how insufficient mine infrastructure would be in the face of that. And so in the Taku watershed, the Taku River Tlingit have declared an Indigenous protected and conservation area over 60% of the watershed. They announced this last year, and they're really working to manage the watershed at a scale that takes into account things like climate change with their land use planning. One of your speakers later today, Tara Marsden from the Gitnyao, is going to speak to this in quite a bit more detail, so I'm just going to mention it here. But BC's Mineral Tenure Act is really a barrier to protecting watersheds and salmon and people. The only thing I would like for you to take away from this picture is that where you can see here where this is the black lines drawn around, so that's a glacier, that's an enormous glacier in the Taku watershed. And mining companies are staking claims on this glacier because they anticipate that once the ice melts, that will be a mineral resource for them. And so, and because mining companies are allowed to stake claims without any type of free, prior, and informed consent from, in this case, the Taku River Tlingit First Nation, these claims are staked before the ice has even melted off these glaciers. And so this obviously prevents a real challenge in these watersheds. And some of the solutions that are coming forth from the Taku River Tlingit First Nation and then around the world is these concepts of conferring legal personhood to rivers and glaciers. So providing legal rights to rivers and important pieces of the landscape that can't speak for themselves. And there's been some cases where this legal personhood has really protected, in this case, like a glacier over the long run, where the legal protections have actually stood up in court. And these are mostly examples from around the world. But really a unique, creative, and wonderful solution, I think, to some of these bigger problems. Another challenge has to do with a lack of enforcement. You guys, it sounds like I've talked about a lot of the importance of water quality data and baseline data collection across the board. And one of the problems that arises is that you can set water quality thresholds, for example, in a mine environmental assessment process, but they're actually not legally enforceable. And so here again, where I am in the Elk Valley, the river is way beyond the thresholds that were set in the Elk Valley. So for example, the number 2 is protective of aquatic life for selenium, and selenium is present in this river up to 140 micrograms per liter. So we're, over 100 times or 70 times what's considered protective of aquatic life. Despite these exceedances of thresholds, there has not been, that hasn't affected the pace of the mining in this valley. So without legally enforceable standards in your permits, it's very difficult to enforce and hold proponents accountable. And I put the Bruce Jack mine up here because it's often held up. Their permit does include legally enforceable thresholds. And they also really paid attention to surface water and groundwater in setting their thresholds. And so it's very important to include those things. And then underground mining is less impactful than overground mining or mountaintop removal mining, as in the case of the Elk Valley. So just these considerations that can really lend to long-term protection of the resources, the values that are so important. And several First Nations have put forth examples in the last decade on building these legally enforceable thresholds into permits. And I heard you guys talking about lawyers needing good legal representation, and that's really what it takes to ensure that those water quality standards that you put in place will be enforced over time. Another problem that we have sorry, I muted myself. I was trying to make my top bar go away, but I haven't figured out how to do that. Another problem is that we often, land use planning and mines occur in steps and piecemeal. And so it's one tiny mine, and then it's two mines, or it's one mine and then an expansion of that mine. And so really looking at your landscape and your watershed at the scale of the river, knowing where the resources are underground, and then anticipating what is the future of this industry on this watershed. What are the thresholds? How much mining is going to be allowed at a very large scale? And setting, again, those thresholds at the watershed scale. And remembering that, currently the province of British Columbia has a 2-zone mining policy. Anything that isn't off limits for mining is open to mining. And so just knowing that if you don't set something aside and explicitly state that it's not to be mined, then it has the potential to be mined. And I put in here, this map is a picture of the Elk River where I am right now. And the yellow in the picture is the coal deposit. So the coal underlying the watershed is quite rich and quite extensive. It runs north to south. And, 80 years ago, the only mine in this watershed was this one down here, the Coal Mountain mine. And over time, the mine footprint has grown into 5 open pit coal mines, and they're all proposed to be expanded right now. So just as I said, understanding the extent of the underground resource, and then planning, as was just said, 7 generations ahead, what is it going to look like centuries from now on the landscape, and what will be the extent of the development? Let's see. Another challenge, and again, this example is from the Elk Valley, and I think it's important to note that I come from a place that is a bit of a worst case scenario. I think we've learned a lot of the hard lessons here in the Chinaka Nation transboundary territory with the Elk Valley mines. And so all lessons that can be learned from this landscape with the long history of mining here, I think are really important to share and communicate. And so another hard lesson has been that the mitigation technologies that were promised to clean up the contamination and mitigate the damage that's been done to the watershed have really failed to meet what was promised. And a lot of that has to do with the province accepting the mitigation technology without actually verifying that it works beforehand. And one important piece of that is really having independent scientific assessment of your mitigation technologies, not relying on the proponent or even the provincial government to verify that what's going to protect your waters is that they have checked the box on that. And in the Elk Valley, we've learned that the hard way. This is a picture of a wastewater treatment plant downstream of a mine. The wastewater treatment plants, there was 23 that were promised to be built in this watershed over 10, 15 years. 2 of them have been built so far, operating at full scale, and they have had numerous problems with their performance. They still have never met what they promised to do, and the contaminant trends in this river were supposed to be stabilized and reversed over time, and they have not stabilized nor reversed. The contaminant trends in the rivers are still going up. And so, unfortunately, the mitigations that were promised have not performed in the way that they were expected, and that has had really big consequences for water quality and fish, and human drinking water wells, just all the impacts that you get from mining in this valley. I also heard you talking about this today, so I won't go into it in great detail, but one of the things that I'm doing up here in the Elk is going out with Tunaka Nation and collecting water quality data. We're doing water quality monitoring throughout the river, upstream and downstream of the mines, to get a non-mined condition and a mined condition. And I think that empowering First Nations to get out and collect their own data, keep their own records, have complete access to everything that the proponent is doing as well. But having sovereignty over data collection and analysis and how that's used in enforcement, I think, is critical in success as far as having any industry at all in these watersheds. And, you know, in the Elk and many other watersheds, you see where the proponent is in charge of collecting the data, they're in charge of reporting the data, and then, you know, enforcement and regulation may or may not follow. The other thing that I often see in the data collection and approach to environmental assessment is, you know, I said this early on, but just an omission of traditional knowledge and cultural values. Those are often an afterthought in assessment, and really they should be centered. The entire, you know, approach to how these mines might impact a landscape should be centered on the cultural landscape. And I put these pictures of these aquatic insects up here as an example. In the Elk Valley, often the proponent here will, so for example, when they go out and collect aquatic insects, these are what feed all of the fish in the rivers here. They'll only identify them down to like the genus. So they go a much higher level of identification for the insects, rather than looking at, you know, exactly what type of mayfly or caddisfly or stonefly this is. And by doing that, they really miss the impacts. So we're losing the diversity of aquatic insects in the Elk River. It's been greatly impacted by the mining. But if you don't look at the diversity of aquatic insects, then you'll never know that you're actually losing it. And so by working with the nation to collect this data, we're trying to ensure that we get the whole picture on what the impacts of the mining is having in the river. And just overall, I think this is one of the most important things to take home and try to address, is that these all creates an enormous burden on the First Nation. All of these shortcomings that can happen create both a financial capacity, human burden on the nations. So, funding for participation in environmental assessments. If a mining company wants to put a mine into a watershed, there should be a separate blind trust set aside for baseline studies that are led by the nation, and need to take into consideration long-term monitoring. Baseline data is really important, but long-term monitoring at every single stage of the mine life cycle and far beyond it is critical over time. Bonding has been identified as being completely underwhelming for the scale of impacts these mines can have. We don't bond at the scale that we need to, and that should be the responsibility of industry. And then, as we talked about a little bit, high quality legal representation to ensure that all of these rights will be upheld at the end of the day. Some of the tools for making some of these things happen, again, coming out of some of the nations in these landscapes. So the Tunaqa Nation recently signed their own agreement with the mining company that gave them regulatory authority, decision-making authority, and an equal seat at the decision-making table. So rather than having the province as a go-between between the nation and the mining company, the Tunaqa have placed themselves squarely at the table and ultimately have veto rights should the mining company not perform as promised in the landscape. And that's a legally enshrined agreement. So if, as I think Kirby was saying this morning, you collect your data, you go back and find that they're actually not meeting the thresholds that they said they would, having the right in a legal document to excuse a mining company from the landscape is a really sort of a landmark deal that is emerging from some First Nations across some of these watersheds. Another problem, again, related to excluding Indigenous governments from the decision-making table. So this map shows the entire transboundary Kootenay watershed, and you can see that, you know, it originates up here in Southeast British Columbia, crosses into Montana and Idaho, back up into BC and into the Columbia River Basin. The mining considerations in this watershed are basically right here. This is the Elk River. And so again, sort of looking at a watershed scale, anticipating the fate of mining across an entire watershed, across multiple nation boundaries and territories, and really insisting that mine impacts be considered at that watershed scale, I think is so important. The data collection, you know, data is collected different in the Elk River than it is down in Montana, than it is up over here in Kootenay Lake. And that's all connected water. They've found mine contaminants from the mines are right here, all the way over here, over 300 kilometers downriver of the origination of the contaminants for the mines. So knowing that that's how mine impacts work and how far they can reach over time, I think is really important, in anticipating that in watershed planning. The Transboundary Tunaqa Nation has proposed to the governments, all the governments involved, Canada, US, province, that they create an Indigenous-led watershed board that puts the leadership of the nation at the table at the watershed scale and has input on the science and governance of mining in the watershed. And that's been the solution that's been put forth by the nation. And that's everything I have. I hope I didn't put us behind schedule. And I'm really happy to have any conversation. And as I said, provide, you know, any further information following our discussion.